Kia ora everyone, haere mai. Welcome to the webinar session with Riana. I'm Maya Marie, and before we get into the good stuff, we are going to just start with some housekeeping and bits and bobs. Also do a karakia to start us off. Cool. Uh, Tāpua, tāpua, tāpua kia wānanga. Wānanga ki uta. Wānanga ke tai. Wānanga te tikanga. Te tikanga ānuku. Te tikanga ārangi. Kia hua te tikanga. Kia pupuke amahara. O haumie huie taekie. Sweet. Yeah, we can get into the housekeeping now. Hopefully some slides will show. Sweet. So yeah, this is the Neoliberalism and Te Tiriti or Waitangi session with the one and only Riana. And I think, yeah, here we go. This is our community code of conduct. It's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, just to respect each other, be kind to each other. For those watching, we have a live chat. So feel free to interact with the kōrero. We'll also have a Q&A towards the end. So yeah, just when using that chat, just be mindful of everyone else in this space. I think there's also going to be some accessibility. Yeah. So if you're wanting captions or the transcript, you should be able to find that with these links or in your toolbar just by pressing the CC button. Epic. I guess the other things viewers should know is there's a moderator on hand in case we need them. And as this is a live webinar session, there could be some potential technical difficulties. So fingers crossed there won't be any issues, but yeah, just a pre-warning before we get into it. Now, Rihanna, do you want me to introduce you or would you like to introduce yourself?
Kei aku iwa, up to you.
All right. I found your little bio based on the Involves website. So yeah, I'm happy to. So for those who don't know, but I'm sure everybody here does, this is Riana Te Ngahue. She is a Māori lawyer and social media influencer. She's best known for her political commentary, particularly on topics related to Te Tiriti or Waitangi and perspectives on Māori legislation. Her work often focuses on making complex political issues accessible and relatable for younger audiences. And I'll hand over to you from here.
Ka pai. Tēnā koe mai Marie. O te rā tēnā tātou katoa. O Riana Te Ngahue tōku ingoa, he uri no Ngāti Porou, ko te whānau Te Aupare me te whānau Kahunga Hapu. Yeah, so my dad is from Ngāti Porou on the East Coast and my mum's Canadian, so I like to say I'm Ngāti Porou and Ngāti maple syrup. That's my little pitch. Yeah, I guess I've oh yes, a couple of haha reacts. So I've been making content on the internet for a couple of years now, and it was a bit of a snowball effect for me because I initially made a video about the Oranga Tamariki Act, which had to do with the removal of a particular section, Section 7AA, that was targeted towards balancing out the inequities for tamariki Māori in state care. The ACT Party campaigned on removing that section, and then obviously there was a huge outrage about it, uproar, and the Māori Party came out with a slogan, not one more mokopuna, which they were saying, you know, protect our mokopuna. And in the comments and the commentary that I could see online, there was a bit of a misunderstanding on both sides of the fence as to what was happening. So there was the ACT Party saying that this section of the Act was causing what they call reverse uplifts, where Māori babies were getting taken out of safe Pākehā homes just because they were Pākehā. And the ACT Party was saying this is an outrage, even though they had no evidence to back up their claims that this was happening as a result of this section. And then on the other hand, some Māori Party supporters were saying that the ACT Party's trying to change the law so that Māori babies only go to Pākehā homes or can't go to Māori homes. And I could see there was just a bit of misunderstanding as to what the actual section did. So that was the first video I made, was explaining the practicalities of that section. And then everything kind of snowballed from there. I never really thought that many people would care. I thought maybe there'd be like a couple of hundred people on TikTok that might be a little bit interested, but no, it snowballed from there. And then I eventually made a video about the Treaty Principles Bill when the ACT Party rolled that out. On the same basis, was that I could see the arguments that were coming forward about the Treaty Principles Bill didn't really understand what the Treaty of Waitangi actually said. And there were really passionate, emotive people saying, you know, the Treaty of Waitangi is oppressing all of us. It creates these unfair advantages, tima, without actually understanding what the articles of the treaty said. And so I just tried to make a quick blitz. What did the Māori rangatira sign? What's happened since? And that was a video that got a lot of engagement on it, I guess, because while the hikoi was going on and there was so much, pro-treaty and anti-treaty rhetoric out there, people who didn't have that background of or have those conversations in their daily life were really looking for something to give them a balanced view on where they could sit. And it was hard because there was once again the side of the treaty's evil, treaty is creating unfair advantages and ruining Aotearoa. And then there was the pro-treaty side, which sometimes, from my perspective, didn't go deep enough to explain why are we for the treaty, you know, why is upholding the Treaty of Waitangi valuable for all people in Aotearoa. So that was kind of the line I was trying to hit. Yeah.
I think you hit it really well. That was the first piece of your content that I ever came across, and been following your journey since. Sorry to butt in, but I was thinking it would be cool to do like a bit of an icebreaker question, and I feel like you've kind of set me up well for this. You mentioned last week when we spoke not to ask you about the haters, so I promise that's not where this is going. But keen to hear just like some more of the positive experiences that you've had since your platform's kind of blown up in the ways that it has, if you want to share.
Yeah, that's a cool part. One that really stood out to me last year was my partner is a teacher aide at an intermediate school, and the kaiako matua, or the kaiako, said to the students in the class, how many of you guys have seen Matua Tamati's partner's videos? And about 3/4 of this intermediate class put their hands up in terms of having seen my videos. And that made me go, oh my gosh, first of all, I need to stop swearing. And then secondly, what a privilege it is, or what a blessing it is to have people that young engaged in this kind of kōrero. It really blew me away, because when I was in intermediate school, all I was thinking about was, can I get hot chips after school? Not all about protesting or defending, Te Tiriti or Waitangi. So that was really positive for me, a really big beacon, I guess, of keep going. And then another blessing that I was thinking about the other day was that since I've started making content, I've actually had quite a big number of people from the older generation, when I come across them at different kaupapa or in the wharekai or whatever, they will talk to me about their views of the world or the treaty, or what they imagine for a new Aotearoa. And some of these people, you can tell they've thought about it for years, and they're really carefully thought out ideologies that they're choosing to share with me because they connected with some of the videos, or they appreciated some of the videos. And every time I'm sitting there listening to these people from, a different generation than me, like openly telling me these things, I just think, wow, what a privilege it is to have access to this kind of whakaaro, because I know that otherwise I never would have, because they wouldn't have just rattled that off the bat kind of thing. So yeah, that was another thing I was thinking about the other day that was truly positive, of like, wow, I'm getting to expand my worldview from people who are just willingly offering their gems, you know? So yeah.
Totally. Oh, that's so special. What a great answer. Thank you for sharing. Cool. So I think you've got some slides. Shall we jump into it?
Yep, can't play. Just before I put the slides up. So from the snowballing of the different pieces of legislation that I used to run my mouth about, I kind of realized after a while that I was, fighting these fires that felt massive at the time, but they just kept popping up all over the field. And I thought, why do they just keep rolling out new legislation that's terrible over and over again? And so I started to look into broader political ideology stuff in the big academic debates, which I'd never ever got into, because from a position of privilege, it didn't really affect me too much which party was in, even though I didn't like the ideology of national or whatever. At the end of the day, I'm not the demographic that's going to really feel the whip of the belt kind of thing. And so when I started getting into the politics stuff and I started zooming out, I realized, oh my gosh, this is so much bigger than just the Treaty Principles Bill or the pay equity bill. Like, there's all these different fires burning in the field, but actually the whole field's on fire, which may not actually be
Yeah.
a very positive way to look at it. But for me, zooming out and kind of seeing the bigger landscape, while daunting in its own way, actually made me feel, I guess, a bit less crazy. Like, oh, okay, I can see where you're coming from and the wave that you're trying to take us on, rather than all of these random fires that just seemed like they needed to be put out and then would be okay. And that's what led me down this path of neoliberalism, which is the kaupapa that I was going to talk about today, which is neoliberalism and Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And Maya Marie has been subject to this yarn twice already, so hopefully it's not too boring for anyone else. But so yeah, this is the kaupapa that I wanted to talk about. So neoliberalism is the overarching political ideology, and why Te Tiriti or Waitangi keeps getting dragged into this mess. So when I looked at neoliberalism generally, there's so much academic debates, so many academic debates, so many articles, reports, analysis, all of these kind of things on neoliberalism and where it fits into different factions of political debate. But in general, neoliberalism has been described as being pro-globalization, pro-privatization, small government, and pushing for economic freedom. I read all of that in about 12 different articles and thought, what are all these things? And so I had to kind of go another layer down and figure out what are these different streams of neoliberalism. And it took a really long time, a lot of reading, to try to finally condense these ideas down. And what I've done with it is put it basically into the way that I think about things. So if you're going for economic freedom, globalization, privatization, and small government, what that really means is that, from my perspective, you believe in three different things. And the first one that I talk about is that companies do it better, and this is related to privatization. And I'm using this word privatization because I have a feeling most of the people on this webinar will likely already be very familiar with the term privatization, and I don't want to preach to the choir for too long. But the way I describe it is companies do it better. So this is the idea that the government running services or owning assets or infrastructure or anything like that is actually a waste of money, because the only thing that really motivates humans is profit. And so we need to be selling everything off to private companies, because they'll be so motivated by profit that they will do all the right investments, make all the right decisions, never fail, and basically make all of our systems more efficient. And I've specifically used this photo here, privatization by stealth, because this is talking about charter schools, which I'm going to come back to later. But the idea behind charter schools is that they're standalone schools that in some sense are private, where the government does not have that same control over that they do on public schools. But the idea of privatizing our entire education system is not palatable. Most people in Aotearoa would go, oh, nah, I don't know about that. Same with the health system. And so what we've seen in this new wave of neoliberalism is privatization by stealth and trying to find almost backdoor ways to get privatization across the line without having to actually sell it to the general public. So that's belief number one. Companies do it better. We've seen it, what happens in the United States with their healthcare system, where it can cost up to 50 grand for a C-section if you give birth. And basically their entire healthcare system is profit driven, which most people in Aotearoa and Australia can't even fathom, that every part of your healthcare needs to come with a price tag. We've seen it tested with prisons and failings of that. And yeah, we've seen privatization in a whole bunch of other places as well. But belief number one, companies do it better. Belief number two, regulations are just hōhā, just like my moved macrons. They're supposed to be over the o and the a. So this is the idea of deregulation, which basically neoliberalists like David Seymour say that all these regulations, or what he calls red tape on companies, are just holding them back. They're stemming innovation. They are stopping capital growth. All of these kind of things is the problem. Regulations is the problem. They're just hōhā. All we need to do is peel these rules off the companies and everything will be right, because they'll be free to max out their profits, and then they'll raise everyone's wages and everyone will become rich. And you can see that David Seymour in particular, because he's our most obvious proponent for neoliberalism, really celebrates this idea of deregulation. And one form of this that really racked me up last year was that they were reviewing the alcohol regulations. And one in particular was the labeling, the alcohol labeling on bottles for pregnancy. So the alcohol industry spent 24 years battling against having to put those labels, the things that say pregnancy, drinking while pregnant can harm your baby. They spent 24 years battling the regulation to have to put those labels on the bottle. And now you'll notice on most bottles, there'll be a red circle around that label. And that's because people that have studied marketing or looked at any of that kind of stuff will know that red is one of the colors that are known to catch your attention. And that's why McDonald's uses it in all of their marketing and their packaging. And so that red circle was recommended by experts to say, hey, we really need to draw people's attention to this, put it around the label. And they are consulting with these alcohol companies on whether or not basically that's too hōhā. And David Seymour made the claim that one craft beer company had said, oh, we just don't want to put the red around the pregnancy warning label because, we only use black and white. We only use one color for our packaging printing, which honestly, I would like to see that proven, because every single craft beer company I know has half the rainbow on their packaging. So if you can't afford to put a red circle around a pregnancy warning label, then maybe you should tone back the rolling orange sunset on the front side of the can, something like that. Anyway, that's the general idea, is that regulations are just hōhā. They're just holding companies back. If we peeled them all off, life would be good. And then belief number 3 is that everyone has the same opportunities. So this is a really core belief of neoliberalism, which is basically that it doesn't really matter how you were raised. It doesn't matter what circumstances you came from. It doesn't matter what opportunities are in front of you right now, everyone has the same opportunities. And you really have to try to convince yourself that this is true if you have done any kind of real world looking into. And this was really prominent in the Section 7AA stuff that I started with, was the idea that there's no difference between Māori and Pākehā babies in state care. Everyone has the same opportunity, so there should be a one-size-fits-all rollout of the system for all tamariki in state care. And this Facebook post by Karen Chur really, really got to me. One step closer to colourblind child-centric care, because it's so intentionally ignorant. Well, it's not really ignorant when you think about it. It's willful ignorance, because they didn't bother to read any of the expert advice that told them that there was no evidence to back up their claim that Section 7AA was wreaking havoc on the state care system. And they also refused to look into the reality that nearly 70% of tamariki in state care are Māori. That is not by accident. And so you're not going to accidentally fix that by rolling out a one-size-fits-all system and calling it colourblind. The system's been colourblind the whole time, but in reverse, I guess. They would just like to say that lack of colourblindness in the past few years since Section 7AA got put in, was creating these terrible outcomes, but couldn't prove it. So I found that really, really hoha. Everyone has the same opportunities is the third belief there. So we've seen these beliefs play out in so many different fields. So companies do it better. They always make the claim that our economy and our productivity is failing because of government intervention, that there's too many regulations, that the government owns too many of these assets and doesn't know what they're doing and are not running things efficiently, and that has contributed to productivity stagnation. So this is to do with how much our economy is producing, basically, and this is true for many countries across the globe, is that productivity has not been increasing hugely year on year. It's stagnated. And so I guess right-wing economists say that because productivity has stagnated, that as a result of that, our living standards have dropped. So, wages don't go as far. People are struggling with rent, mortgage rates, all of those kind of things are a result of the lack of economic growth and productivity stagnation. But it actually doesn't make any sense to correlate those two things, because if productivity was directly related to living standards, then living standards would have stagnated. They wouldn't have dropped. So if you're saying that the only way to maintain living standards is to have unbelievable productivity growth each year, then what a ridiculous system. That's never going to work, because you can't just keep growing something year on year on year. And then the next layer of that argument is trickle-down economics, which is the idea that if you peel off all the rules of companies, they get rich as, and the top of the pyramid gets rich as. That'll flow down to everyone else. Everyone else will get mean wages, and then the economy will grow. But in reality, economic growth comes from working people. It comes from the average consumer having enough money to go out and spend and go to the movies with their kids and get a new car, or go out for dinner with their family. The reality is that middle class people are struggling to be able to afford that now. And the group of people with spending money is getting smaller, like excess spending money is getting smaller and smaller every year. So it's not realistic to think that by letting the top of the pyramid get richer and richer each year, while the middle class loses their wealth, it's delusional to say that tiny little group of people that's getting smaller and smaller each year is going to be able to sustain an economy. So the reality is, if you don't fix living standards for everyday people, the economy is not going to grow. Circling back to the companies do it better. The electricity sector is a really good example of this. John Key partially privatized our electricity sector, and electricity costs for the average person in Aotearoa has grown exponentially ever since then. Capital investment, so actual investment in the infrastructure, plummeted once it got privatized, and it's slowly partially privatized, and it's been slowly picking back up. But the reality is that they made all these claims that the best way to improve systems is by privatizing them, because people will be so motivated by profit that they will make the systems as efficient as possible. In reality, when it got partially privatized, it was already making money for these investors. So why would they dump a whole bunch of money in it when they could just sit on it and put prices up and still make a good profit? And so, with the gift of hindsight, and also all of the evidence at the time that said privatization won't fix our electricity costs, we can look back now and see not only did electricity costs skyrocket, investment dropped. So the idea that privatization will fix all and companies do it better is a crock of crap. And then we see this in social services as well. So privatizing the youth sector, trying to make that more cost efficient. It's always about cost efficiency. But in reality, what happens when you prioritize cost efficiency in something that's actually about manaaki tangata is that you will get box ticking instead of actual relationship building and that mahi aroha, or that care needed to provide that service really well. Second belief, regulations are just hoha. We see this in our smoke-free laws. So this current government rolled back our smoke-free laws, and we went from being ranked second in the world for the strongest smoke-free laws to last year we were dubbed the Dirty Ashtray Award for basically having, trying to say this in a good way, we basically dropped our nuts to the tobacco industry and gave them everything they wanted, peeled back all those rules. Second example of this is our supermarkets. So a couple of decades ago, we had a bunch of different supermarket chains and they started merging. Our competition laws in New Zealand weren't very strong. We allowed a lot of these big mergers to happen, and now we have Foodstuffs and Woolworths who just absolutely ream the market, and they push out small suppliers, they push out smaller competition, they strong arm suppliers. The Labour Party tried to do put some laws in to protect suppliers in that system, but I don't know how effective that's been so far, but at least they tried. This current government is talking about trying to break up these two jumbo companies, but we'll see if they actually do that. And then, oh, sorry, I forgot to make that point there. So regulations are just hoha. No, they're not. They're actually protections for our people as well. Smoke-free laws weren't just about curtailing profits for the tobacco industry. They were also about protecting the health of people in Aotearoa. But that doesn't matter if your goal is neoliberalism. And then supermarkets, the goal would obviously be keeping prices reasonable for people in Aotearoa, but that doesn't matter if you're pro-neoliberalism. And then third belief here, everyone has the same opportunities, rides on this idea that just work harder and you'll crack it. And then the flip side of that belief is that if you don't crack it, you just simply weren't good enough. That's apparent in the Section 7AA repeal, where they're saying there's no reason to specifically protect aspects of te ao Māori within the state care system because everyone's exactly the same. They just need to work harder. And the youth justice boot camps were another good example, and also a really good example of why I just get really racked up with this government, because all of the evidence from all the experts at the time said youth justice boot camps have no history of being effective in reducing youth crime. There's no evidence that your new renamed version of it is going to have any positive impacts. They did it anyway, dropped like $5 million or something into it and got the exact outcomes that were already predicted. In terms, I think they had like a 90% reoffending rate in the first like few months when these kids got released. So not only is it wasted money, so cost inefficient. First of all, you're breaking your own rules. Secondly, it's just aroha kore. Like, there's no whakaaro nui for our tamariki. They're not in these positions committing these crimes because they just woke up one day and decided they want to commit crimes. Anybody who's worked anywhere near this sector will know these kids have suffered. Most of these kids have suffered severe trauma, and that trauma has to be addressed before you're going to just suddenly boot them up the arse and they're going to stop committing crimes. So that whole youth justice boot camp stuff was really frustrating for me, and they got the exact same outcomes that were expected and sunk a whole bunch of money into it. So companies do it better. Regulations are just hoha. Everyone has the same opportunities. And then narrowing into Te Tiriti o Waitangi, even though this is applicable across pretty much all of our different legislative reforms. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, I'm not going to preach to the choir too much, but we know that Te Tiriti o Waitangi Article 2 guaranteed tino rangatiratanga over whenua, kāinga and taonga, and this is a huge problem for neoliberalism. Historically, Te Tiriti o Waitangi prior to 1975 didn't have a lot of legal bite. So the court said that it was null and void, and then basically it was treated as such for a really good period of time. In 1975, the government finally started accepting that they're going to have to try to remedy some of these breaches, and the Waitangi Tribunal was established and all of these kind of things. But even then, the legal bite that Te Tiriti o Waitangi had is pretty much like a mouth guard, because this actual guarantee of tino rangatiratanga has never been upheld in the way that it should have been. And neoliberalism knows that if tino rangatiratanga was actually afforded or upheld as a guarantee through Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it would be a huge barrier for so many neoliberal projects. So from a neoliberalist perspective, you would be thinking, how can I get rid of any legal bite that Te Tiriti o Waitangi has, even though it's not that much comparatively to what it should be? So the first act that I'm going to talk about is the Treaty Principles Bill, but that was pretty much trying to be the sledgehammer that would just come and stomp the whole of Te Tiriti o Waitangi down in kind of one foul swoop. So the Treaty Principles Bill was about the protection of equal rights, but only to the extent that I say so. So it talks about in this Principle 2 here, which is supposed to emulate the articles, is that the Crown recognises and will respect the rights that hapu and iwi Māori had under the Treaty of Waitangi at the time they signed it. That on its own, okay, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, Māori had tino rangatiratanga back then. Caveat, however, if those rights differ from the rights of everyone else, Subclause 1 only applies if those rights are agreed to in a settlement of a historical treaty claim under the Treaty of Waitangi Act. This is unbelievably unjust, because absolutely no iwi at the time that they were negotiating their treaty settlements thought all of our rights as a people will need to be codified in this settlement. And if that had been the case at the time that these were being negotiated, negotiations would have looked totally different, because that's saying all of your rights since the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi need to be set out in this settlement. Oh, the scraps would have been even huger than they already were. And to retrospectively say that, to look back and go, oh, unless you put it in your treaty settlement, it doesn't count, it's just unbelievably unjust. So the Treaty Principles Bill was about basically taking all of the bite out of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and those equal rights. Charter schools is The next one I wanted to talk about, which I mentioned earlier, which is basically the privatization by stealth of the education sector. I don't necessarily have a problem with charter schools as a concept. I like the idea of schools having flexibility and providing education in a way that meets the needs of their specific students. It's the way they've gone about it, where if you followed any of the stuff that happened with Kelston Boys High School, they basically had a hostile takeover attempt where this random trust came in and said, oh, we want to convert your school into a charter school. And there was no engagement with the board of trustees or the parents. It was, I think the criteria for basically a hostile takeover is you have to have some kind of link to the school. So any alumni or somebody who's related to the school in some way can essentially put together a hostile takeover claim. And the Kelston Boys High School had to fight basically to keep the school in the control of the board, which took resources, which took time. They had to engage with their whānau. They had to prepare responses. If the school itself is not putting forward a proposal to convert to a charter school, it's just unbelievably unfair to expect them to use those resources up defending their right to exist as they already are. But the thing that really raises another red flag on charter schools is the way that David Seymour has co-opted Māori schools to be basically a way that he can say, we uphold tino rangatiratanga. So he used Hato Tipene, also St. Stephen's School, which opened as a charter school. He said, charter schools like Tipene show tino rangatiratanga in action. ACT's decades-long commitment to school choices is based on our core belief that local communities know what works for them. They just need to be empowered to put their ideas into action. Sure, but you're not the bringer of tino rangatiratanga. St. Stephen's was going to open anyway, and they were going to open on their terms and uphold tino rangatiratanga in their way. You did not provide that avenue for them on your own. So the thing I don't like about it is the way he co-opts it into saying, I basically am the savior of tino rangatiratanga. The next one I wanted to talk about was the Resource Management Act. And you can see on the left-hand side here, David Seymour says, this is why we can't have nice things. And basically it's conditions in a resource consent that iwi have to be engaged. There's cultural monitoring and engagement with mana whenua. And he's saying that engagement with mana whenua is the reason why we can't get anything across the line. And this is because of the belief that regulations are just hoha and that allowing mana whenua to have any kind of say is just an administrative step. It's got nothing to do with upholding rights under Te Tiriti or Waitangi. It's just a hoha barrier that's slowing down the consenting process. So this idea that regulations are just hoha feeds into this reform of the Resource Management Act. So the submission, I just took this little snippet from Tino Poro's submission on the reforms that are upcoming. In this structure, participation is treated as if it were sufficient protection for Māori interests, but it is not. Being consulted, invited to submit, or asked to comment does not give iwi and hapu the ability to prevent harmful decisions being made at the national level, nor does it ensure that tikanga rangatiratanga and mātauranga Māori will actually shape the final settings. The bills largely frame Māori interests as matters to be addressed through procedural steps and administrative mechanisms, rather than as a binding obligation that must determine the substance of national direction and constrain the decisions made under it. So this is basically just saying that Māori are tick box. There's no actual bite in Te Tiriti or Waitangi when it comes to the Resource Management Act. As long as Māori are invited to submit or somebody goes and has a chat to them, then you're sweet as, tick it off and roll on. And then the last one I wanted to talk about was the Regulatory Standards Act, which is basically all about the protection of property rights and commercial interests, but not yours. So one of the key principles under the Regulatory Standards Act is the taking or the protection from the taking of property. So legislation should not take or severely impair or authorize the taking or severe impairment of property without the consent of the owner, unless there is good justification or fair compensation. When I first read that principle, I was like, okay, I kind of get it, in the way that every piece of legislation that David Seymour puts forward is written from a common sense perspective. But when you actually start to unpick the threads, that's when you really see what he's going for. And when I first read this principle, I thought, okay, there has to be good justification or fair compensation. Do you know where there wasn't? Confiscations for Māori land interests. Are they going to address that? So I went through the Act further. Oh no, explicitly in the excluded legislation part is any treaty settlement bills. So even though the Regulatory Standards Bill Act puts a huge emphasis on the protection of property rights, that does not extend to Māori property rights that were stomped on. And there's no right to go and renegotiate treaty settlements in light of this Regulatory Standards Act. So the whole thing is very calculated and very intentional. So it's the protection of my property rights, but not yours, because yours don't count. And that's where we see this idea, this neoliberal idea, that everyone has the same opportunities, because they don't want to remedy anything or actually look at where the injustices occurred. This is just how it is now. Your property rights don't count. We're moving on in the way that I want to. So yeah, those are the 4 pieces of legislation that I wanted to kind of talk about specifically through the neoliberalism lens. But yeah, overall, companies do it better. Regulations are just hoha, and everyone has the same opportunities. We can see those beliefs flow through so many of the legislative reforms that have been made by this current government. But yeah, tēnā tātou. Hopefully that wasn't too boring.
Nah, not boring at all. That was, like you say, my third time hearing your kōrero, and I still learned so much. I'm still soaking it all in. So, kia ora. Thank you for sharing, Riana. I can tell in the chat, the audience, they're really enjoying it too. We do have a couple of questions now, so if you're keen, we can start on those. And yeah, hopefully we'll get a couple more in as well.
Okay.
All right. From Chris Hickinson, they say, Riana, there are a lot of swing voters out there in my older Pākehā, especially in women age groups. Yes, we listen to you too, so ka pai for speaking out to all age groups. What are your 2026 election plans?
As in who I'm going to vote for?
I guess so. Just like keen to hear your whakaaro on the election coming up.
My election plans is to try to get people to vote. I'm still working out how I'm going to do that. Yeah, if anyone's not enrolled to vote, that'd be a really good idea. I will, at this point, almost definitely vote Greens, because I just think a lot of their policies are really well informed and evidence-based, and it actually took like a bit of rewiring of my brain to really look into the Greens, because as I was growing up, what I heard was National's good for business, Labour's good for workers, and the Greens are like airy-fairy hippies that don't know how the real world works. And it wasn't until I actually read their policies that I went, oh, all of these are actually evidence-based. Like they're not just making this stuff up. And listening to them talk about things, I went, oh, okay. That's totally logical. And then I noticed it in the media with the way that they talk about the Greens. They always try to frame it as the irrational, silly young girls, or the hippies that don't really know what's going on and that kind of thing, even when they're speaking from just factual evidence. And I found that quite woha. But in terms of election plans, I'm not running for Parliament. I'd get cancelled too fast. But yeah, I'll I want to make a set like a series, I guess, or a breakdown of the different parties' policies to try to help us, I guess, especially rangatahi that are just getting into this, getting into politics, which there's way more rangatahi, I think, these days that are getting into politics than it was in my day. Well, back in my day.
Cool. Thank you for that answer. I really hope you do make that series. Like, even the last election, I was working full time in flighting, but I was 17. And so it was really hard to watch and not be able to like cast a vote, have a say.
Mm,
And just like trying to get my head around all of it is a lot. So yeah, very grateful for the work that you do.
mm.
Okay. From Danny McLean. Sorry if I mispronounced that, Danny. They say, me and kōrero, Riana, something I get stuck on is the intergenerational communication about these issues. How do we avoid getting the brush off from older decision makers? Because each generation is living totally different impacts of neoliberalism. For example, me as an older rangatahi versus younger rangatahi now, versus my parents' generation who were raised before heaps of these neoliberal policies came in as hard. How do we bridge the gap in understanding when lots of older generations are drawing on their own experiences of the world from 20, 30, or 40 years ago?
Oh, that's such a good question. Um, yeah, I do not talk to my nan about this kind of stuff because the conversations never go well. Um, I think there's like a specific way that you have to approach the conversations. Like whenever I talk to somebody kind of new about these kaupapa and I'm not sure kind of where they sit, I always test the waters a bit because sometimes if you go in really hard on like, neoliberalism is the cause of the drop in living standards and the rising house prices and all this kind of stuff, people get really barred up quite quickly. Um, like I remember this used to happen with me and my dad when I'd come home from uni, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and straight out of like criminal justice course, and I'd be like, Dad, did you know the criminal justice system's racist? And he would go, No, it's not. My dad's Māori, and he would go, do the crime, do the time, like don't give me any of that crap kind of stuff. And then I'd be like, but did you know that Māori have a higher chance at every stage in the system of moving on to sentencing and blah, blah, blah. And her dad would just be like, oh, get out of here with that stuff. Like, you don't know how the real world works, which is true from his experience, like that's what he's seen in his life. And it's hard to shift someone's entire worldview using stats and theory and lectures from uni and that kind of stuff. Um, so I think sometimes there's little windows of opportunity, like for example, house prices, I think is a really good one where people from the older generation look at the house prices now and go, I can't believe that you're paying $800 for a 3 bedroom house to rent, in Wellington kind of thing. Like my mum and dad was saying they paid like $150 a week for a 4 bedroom house, which, is unfathomable to me. So I think things like that are little windows of opportunity where you can really start having that conversation on a deeper level. But I've kind of had to learn that I can't, and I tried, because when I used to get people that would argue with me on social media, and I would think, oh no, if I just explain it a bit better, they'll get it and they'll change their mind. And then I would go really hard and I'd do my absolute best at explaining it. And then I realized at the end of the day, they actually don't care. They just want to be angry at me or they just want to blame somebody else. It doesn't really matter what anything says. And so I think reading the play a bit and figuring out whether there's a window of opportunity or there's, a brick wall that you're scraping. Yeah.
Epic. Thank you for that. We got one more from an anonymous, but they say, Kia ora, Riana. what is your perspective on the fisheries bill and how it relates to neoliberalism?
Um, to be honest, all the stuff I know about the fisheries bill was from Matt the fishing guy, who makes those videos about it. Um, I haven't looked at it properly, so I wouldn't want to make a call on it, but it sounds like it's another bill that really prioritizes commercial interests and basically everyone else's um, second tier priority. But yeah, I'm sorry, that's about all I know of the fisheries bill.
Fair enough. Well, just now we got another one in. Pati Pua says, with all the different kaupapa to prioritize Te Tiriti, how do you decide which ones you prioritize?
What was the first half, sorry?
With all the different kaupapa to prioritize within, I think that's what they're trying to say,
Oh yeah.
within the treaty. Yeah.
Um, I I'm really passionate about oranga tamariki stuff. So anything that affects oranga tamariki or youth justice or rangatahi kaupapa in that sense, I get really wrapped up on anyway, and I kind of do read those kaupapa anyway. So when those ones come out, I already have a bit of prior knowledge. Whereas for things like the taiao or the environment, I get wrapped up about that stuff too. But also, I know that there's lots of really awesome Māori in the taiao space that do this kind of mahi where they explain like what's happening with the legislative change. Like Tina Poro, for example, she's one of my idols. Um, and yeah, so I guess I pick things to talk about that I feel like I can add a bit of value on. If I think that it's already been done really well, usually I'll just try to share that. But you're right, there's so many different things. And I used to get like bombarded with people asking me, "Oh, can you talk about this? Can you talk about this?" And it just got to a point where I tried to, like I started making videos on like the Overseas Investment Act and stuff. Um, and it was too much. It was, yeah, there was things every single day. And so I kind of had to take a step back and go, well, okay, I don't get paid for this. I'm probably sacrificing my actual job here. Um, so I'm just going to stick with the ones that I have a bit of prior knowledge on or already work in that arena, just to kind of conserve my strength. Otherwise, I was just getting too, I guess, toxic. Like I was across all of these different kaupapa, and anyone that would bite back on me, I would, so I was like, okay, pick your battles now. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good call. I feel like it would be so easy to burn out trying to cover all of the different kaupapa as well. That's
Mm.
there's a lot emotionally and mentally. So fair enough. I'm going to be cheeky and answer the last two questions, but we are running out of time. So apologies for kind of dropping these on you with such little timing. Um, Christelle says, Kia ora, Riana. It would be awesome for you to share your thoughts on how we can ensure this current government becomes a one-term party. What do you, what do we, the people, need to know to vote confidently? I see so many confused out there.
Um, oh, it's really hard. Okay, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, but I read this article the other day about different tribes of voting. I want to try to explain this like baptism by fire. But one was educated progressives, which is pretty much where I sit. So people that um, I guess are on the left, but also are in positions of privilege, like me having the academic privilege that I have and all of those kind of things. Then you've got like the standard conservatives who are increasingly more men, and educated progressives are increasingly more women, like statistically. And then you've got centrists or swing voters, and then you've got like disenfranchised right-wing voters. So that's people that aggressively blame immigrants and anti-abortion and all of these kind of things that are almost like what they call a fringe group. And then on the far left of that is what they call essentially it's like the vulnerable left. So the people that are pro-left ideologies, but they are the ones that actually feel the whip of the belt when these things change, and so they don't trust the institutions. And the problem is that educated progressives trust the institutions and think if we just fix these policies, then everything would be all right. But the vulnerable ones on the left that actually feel the effects don't trust it. And they were saying that the big problem with the Labour Party is that the Labour Party has become full of educated progressives and no longer has the like real life experience of the people that actually feel the whip of the belt. And so that's why the Labour Party has been losing support in a period of time where they really should be gaining a lot more. So that was one thing that I really went, oh wow, yeah, I'd never thought about that. And then outside of those whole 5 tribes of voting is the non-voters who have absolutely no trust in the system. And so they think, I'm not going to vote at all. Basically, Labour and National focus on the swing voters, trying to get those. And I think that the Greens, or I guess the left, need to focus on, the swing voters, but also the non-voters, and trying to find a way to, because that's actually the biggest group, to try to find a way for people to believe in the legitimacy of the system. Yeah, sorry, that might have just been an absolute mess, but it was the first thing that came to mind.
No, I think that hit the spot. So true what you're saying. And always good to reaffirm these things. All right. Last one from M. They say, love your mahi, Riana. Aotearoa seems to have an obsession with now and short term, what individuals and businesses can get. What are your thoughts for the antidotes to beliefs you outlined that all of us can help with? That's a great last question.
Mm. I guess like making sure you have the emotional capacity to have those conversations with your own whānau, because that's really what makes the difference. And I remember talking to one of my whānau members, and I was saying, oh, I try to make videos for people that don't vote and for people that might not have any background knowledge on some of these topics. And they said, yeah, but don't underestimate the value of having that conversation with people that already do vote and they're already engaged in these kōrero, but would just like a more comprehensive way to explain it to their own family. Because they were saying at the end of the day, the non-voters and the people that are disengaged aren't watching your stuff. And they're never going to. But the best you can try to aim for is to equip more people with the ability to explain these things well, so they can go home and talk directly to their own whānau members. And that was, a good one that stuck with me. I think probably that's something we can all do in that space. Yeah. Tēnā tātou.
Yeah. Kia ora. Yeah, great reminder and definitely a good takeaway for myself and everyone listening. Well, thank you so much, Riana. It's been so good to hear your kōrero, and I'm sure everyone else has really enjoyed it. While we wrap up, just want to give a shout out to firstly the youth, the rangatahi that came up with the idea for this webinar, and I think there's like 35 adults who took on the project when it became such a massive thing. It's been so cool to be a part of this kaupapa, and yeah, just shout out to all of you guys because it's been awesome. Just trying to think if there's anyone else. Yes, partners. We should thank the partners. Should be something coming up on the screen shortly. Just want to acknowledge all of the partners for this event. Some of them have got some of their own events coming up soon. So if we've still got viewers online, feel free to check that out. Additionally, all of the recordings from the webinar will be posted on YouTube so you can share with your friends and whānau. Yeah, I think that finishes us off. So thank you all for coming along. Ngā mihi, and thank you as well, Riana.
Tēnā koutou. Ka nui te mihi.